when you look at historical Jesus theories, secular scholars, they theorize that, the disciples were lying, or that the disciples slowly over the generations, these claims were exaggerated, so that Jesus went from being originally just a humble country preacher to this wonder worker, this miracle worker in later Christian generations. But what this book does is, I think it shows that those theories don't stand.
So welcome to the Tyndale House podcast. My name is Peter Williams, the principal at Tyndale House, and glad to be your host today, and very glad to have a special guest, Professor Tom Schmidt, back for a second blast, let's say, of his really phenomenal new book on Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence. So it's really something that we were looking at last episode, how Josephus, this early Christian historian, actually writes about Jesus in two passages, and one of those has been disputed for many years, and Professor Schmidt, Tom, has made an argument that actually the words really do come from Josephus, and so that's really great. And Tom, why don't you just tell us a little bit, introducing your book? Some people may not have got the first episode. Tell us what your book's about, and then we're going to dive into Josephus actually knowing people who had met Jesus. So let's just start off with your book in general.
Yeah, the book, the title is Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. Josephus is a Jewish historian. He wrote in the first century, late first century, and he mentions Jesus, but the passage is very controversial. Most scholars think it's been doctored or interpolated, contaminated by later Christian scribes. So my book, I try to see if I can authenticate the passage, which we talked about last episode, which I think I do successfully. And then in part two, I try to trace out Josephus's pathways of knowledge about Jesus. How did he learn about Jesus? Where is he getting his information from? And that's where I show that Josephus was, it turns out, intimately connected with those who were associated with Jesus's trial.
So you've got a 300-page or plus Oxford University Press book that people can also freely download, which is very enlightened. And that will go into some of the technicalities. We've already seen you make an argument that the style fits with the style of Josephus. And just to remind people of what this passage says, so it's in Josephus's big work, The Antiquities, 20 books of that, History of the Jews. And in book 18, so as we're getting near to the end, he talks about a man. About this time, there lived Jesus, a wise man, if one should ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of many of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, and that's a phrase we're going to come back to in this episode, men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them, restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and a tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. So it sounds, in that translation that I was reading, which is not Tom's translation, it's the Loeb translation, so you can go and get that's quite a standard translation, sounds more Christian than it actually is. Tom argues that it's some of those phrases have been a bit over-egged in translations. And one of the things you do in your book that's fascinating is to sort of map out Josephus's LinkedIn profile, I suppose, who he knew, and how that affects how we should read this stuff. So why don't you take us through that argument?
So Josephus, it turns out, was a man of enormous interpersonal connections in first century Jerusalem. He was from an eminent priestly family. He was a priest. His father and mother were of royal descent. His father was of high priestly descent. And he was rubbing shoulders with the best and brightest of his age and those who were older than him from a very young age. He talks about meeting the chief priests. He knew high priests. He knew the head of the Sanhedrin. He knew members of the Herodian dynasty. He met the empress. He met the emperor. I mean, this guy was as connected as you can get, but he also was stationed in Galilee for 3 years during the Jewish War. And your listeners will recognize this. He visited places like Capernaum, Cana in Galilee, Tiberias. He was stationed in Sepphoris, which was 3 miles down the road from Nazareth. So he has spending his life, he's born in 37 AD in Jerusalem, growing up in Jerusalem in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, stationed in Galilee later on. He's literally spending his whole life where Jesus had ministered, just 1, 2, 3 decades before. So it's at least plausible that he would encounter people who knew Jesus. But I try in my book in chapters 5 and 6 to show why actually I think that we can show that he did know people who knew Jesus.
Why don't you take us into that argument?
Well, if you read the paragraph, his testimony about Jesus, it's called the Testimonium Flavianum. If you read that paragraph carefully, he says it was the first men who accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. And that word first men is protoi in Greek. And if you read with care, you see that in Josephus's autobiography, he says repeatedly that he knew the protoi in Jerusalem. He met them. In fact, he says in 51 or 52 AD, he was continually meeting with the chief priests and the protoi. And it's just simple logic to conclude that, I mean, if 20 years previously, Josephus says in 30 AD, 33 AD, the first men accused Jesus, and then 20 years later, Josephus is saying that I knew the first men, it's only reasonable to conclude that he probably knew some of the people who were part of the trial of Jesus. But that's not everything he says. He says that not that it was the first men, but it was the first men among us who accused Jesus. And that phrase, par emin in Greek, Josephus loves that phrase. He uses it 50 other times. The question is, what does he mean? Does he mean like just a generic, first men of the Jews? Is that what that means? Or is he trying to indicate a closer relationship? And I think when you look at the dozens of times he uses that phrase, it's clear that this is meant to mark a direct personal interaction, a direct knowledge of something. To put it simply, he's claiming to have known some of these first men. And given his background, that's very plausible. I mean, he knew the chief priests and the high priests and the Sanhedrin. These are people associated with the trial of Jesus in the Gospels. So in part, I lay that foundation. And that, I think, gets us to a reasonable amount of probability. But in chapter 6, like you said, I do the LinkedIn, Facebook thing where I track Josephus's social network. And I try to actually find names of people who were at the trial of Jesus or reasonably could be expected to be at the trial of Jesus, whom Josephus also knew. And that's where there's some really remarkable stuff that comes out of this. Josephus is very well connected. Probably the best candidate for someone whom Josephus knew who was at the trial of Jesus is Josephus's own commander in the Jewish war. Josephus was one of 7 generals in the Jewish war, and then there were 2 supreme commanders, and one of them his name is Ananus II. And he was a high priest in 62 AD. He was very old. Josephus says 3 times he was the oldest of the chief priests in 69 AD. So this guy would have been in his 30s or 40s when Jesus was crucified. And it turns out that Ananus II's brother-in-law was Caiaphas, the man who had Jesus crucified, the high priest. And his father was Annas, the high priest, who also was involved in the trial of Jesus.
Yeah.
So we've already got like Josephus's commander was the son and brother-in-law of the gentleman who accused Jesus before Pilate.
And so just to dig down there, so Ananus and Annas are very similar names. They're sort of related, one partly different ways of rendering the same name, Hanan, in Greek. And one of the points you make that's fascinating is that, of course, the trial is on the eve of Passover, and that's when you're supposed to be at your dad's house. So when you've got Jesus going to Annas's house in the record of the trial, then guess who is going to be there? Everyone's gathered together at that time. And so it's almost inevitable that this man who was Josephus's boss at one stage was actually at the trial. You go into that and some other sort of candidates as well. Do you want to talk through those?
Yes, there's several other candidates. If you read the book of Acts, in the early chapters, Rabbi Gamaliel, he presides over the trial of the apostles.
We say Gamaliel in my country, but that's fine. Yeah.
Gamaliel.
Yeah.
And he, we know him from the Jewish Mishnah and Talmud. He was the head of the Sanhedrin. Yeah. Peter says, you murdered Jesus. So Gamaliel clearly had a hand in the trial. Josephus knows the son of Gamaliel. He knows his son. And so we can say the same thing about Simon is his name, about Simon as we can about Josephus's commander, that in 30 AD on the Passover, according to Jewish law, these men who are known to Josephus would have been required to be in Jerusalem, where Jesus was. They would have been required to be in the house of their father celebrating Passover. And where was Jesus brought? The Gospels say he was brought into the house of Annas, the father of Josephus's commander, exactly where, in the same time, same place where Josephus's commander was supposed to have been in accordance with Old Testament law. And we can say the same thing, a similar thing about Josephus's acquaintance, Simon. He would have been in the house of his father, Gamaliel, while he was called to the trial of Jesus. We can't be certain if Simon followed him there. He probably would have been an adult. Simon became the leader of the Sanhedrin later on. So he would have had very good reasons to be at a Sanhedrin trial. But nevertheless, his acquaintance Simon would have seen his father coming and going to the trial of Jesus that night. And there's other candidates too,
Let's keep going. I mean, people don't want to follow up these leads. So you got another one.
He knew a high priest named Joshua. He was one of the high priests. There's only like 15 high priests between, 30 AD and 70 AD. So the fact that Josephus knows 2 or 3 of these guys is quite remarkable. And he even calls the high priest Joshua his friend. He was quite close with him. And Joshua married into an illustrious high priestly family. He became high priest himself. And again, the trial of Jesus, the Gospels say that all the chief priests were there, that all the Sanhedrin was there. We know from the Mishnah and the Talmud that at a trial of a false prophet, which is what Jesus was accused of, that the entire Sanhedrin was required to be present. And this happened in Jerusalem on the Passover, where all faithful Jews were supposed to be present anyway. So we have very good reasons for suspecting that Joshua would have been called to the trial of Jesus, certainly have known about it, have known all about it while it was happening. There's other candidates too. These are not quite as likely, but they're still quite intriguing. For me, my favorite of the remaining is, the famous story of the daughter of Herodias, who is dancing for the head of John the Baptist. The Gospels don't tell us her name, but Josephus does. He says that Herodias had one daughter, and her name was Salome. And Salome went on to marry Aristobulus. He was another Herodian. The Herodians all intermarried. All the cousins were marrying each other. And they both co-reigned for a very long time. Aristobulus lived into the 90s, and Salome lived until at least the late 60s. And Josephus knew Aristobulus and Salome's son. So he knew that the son of the lady who danced for the head of John the Baptist. And there's some scholars hypothesize that he actually knew Aristobulus and Salome themselves directly. And clearly he was capable of this. He was well positioned to do that. And both of those individuals, Salome and Aristobulus, would have been well placed to be a part of the trial of Jesus, because what does Luke say? That Jesus was also brought to the house of Herod the Tetrarch on the Passover. He's the familial patriarch. That's where the Herodians would have gathered for Passover, which means Salome, the daughter-in-law, the stepdaughter, and Aristobulus would have been there when Jesus was brought there. So you can trace out all of these connections quite thoroughly. And one candidate that I only briefly mentioned, but one candidate is just Josephus's father. He was 25 years old when Jesus was crucified. He was an eminent priest. He was in Jerusalem. He would have, the crucifixion of Jesus was a public event. The Gospels say many people saw this. So, he's another plausible candidate. I don't even list him as one of my primary ones, but clearly Josephus knew lots of people, many of whom would have met Jesus directly or even have been at the trial, like I think his commander was.
Yeah, well, that's phenomenal. You're probably one of the very few people on the planet who actually keeps the Herodian dynasty's genealogical line in your head. Most of us mortals look it up and remind ourselves. But one of the things that strikes me just listening to you here is, of course, these are just the people we know about. These are given the limited number of sources that we have for Judaism of Jesus' day. You've got the New Testament, you've got Josephus, we've got later traditions. We don't actually have a lot written about them, but even amongst what we do, we're finding overlaps of personnel that in normal circumstances, provided no one's ill, need to be at the particular places at the right time. And then there must be all the ones we haven't heard of who just names haven't survived in history. And that's remarkable. I seem to remember you say something about the phrase that Josephus uses makes you think that his source of information is these people. So you've got where in this translation, when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified. There's something about that makes you think he's saying, and I talked to them about them. Is that right?
Well, I think it's more. That's more of. I think it's primarily that language is a marker of Josephus saying, "I knew these people." I think it's an inference that he may have learned about Jesus from them. And I think that's reasonable because he was quite well connected with some of these folks. And we know that his commander, Ananus II, the guy whose brother-in-law was Caiaphas and whose father was Annas, that he had dealings with Christians. Josephus tells us that his commander had James, the brother of Jesus, executed, stoned to death. And so clearly Christians, his commander did not like Christians. And Josephus also tells us that because he had James, the brother of Jesus, stoned to death, that his commander lost the high priesthood. So he detested Christians so thoroughly that he was willing to risk his own high priesthood to have James, the brother of Jesus, executed. So what this tells me is that this man, Ananus II, is intimately familiar with Christianity. His family clearly was. He's willing to risk quite a bit in order to stop the spread of this Jesus movement, and that he publicly lost his priesthood, which means Josephus would have known all about this in 62 AD when this happened. So I think it's a very reasonable inference that he learned about Jesus from the enemies of Jesus, so to speak, that he learned about Jesus from Jesus's enemies. But I don't think that's, you mentioned before, there's any number of people, the peasants in Galilee, random citizens of Jerusalem he would have encountered, there's any number of people, some of whom may have been hostile to Jesus, some of whom may have been sympathetic, others may have liked him. There could have been everything in between. So in other words, I think he had about as best information as you could possibly hope for to learn about Jesus.
And one of the things we did in the last episode was look at his particular phraseology and how it comes from Josephus, as in the Josephus writing here, the 89 or 90 words in this passage, have marks of his style. So we talked about this phrase, parhemin, which is, for the Greek geeks out there, para, a preposition, plus hermes, meaning us in the dative case, which is a particularly common phrase. Would you say a phrase like that is, obviously it is used in other Greek writers, but it's a particular thing that alongside other evidences just suggests the whole tenor of this is his style?
Absolutely. He likes that phrase. He uses it 50-something times. And you have to remember that Josephus delights in diversity. He likes having strange phrases. He likes doing unique things. I think at one point, I counted, there's a Greek particle, eti or something, or nun, where he has that in like 18 totally uniquely different phrases. So he doesn't particularly enjoy using phrases repeatedly, but this one he does. And when you look at how he uses it, he always uses it in ways to indicate direct familiarity. So it not only matches his style, it also highlights the fact that he was closely connected with the first men, the protoi, who accused Jesus.
And when you then put together the phrase, the first men amongst us, those are both Josephine phrases in their own right, and then together a sort of super Josephine phrase.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Precisely.
So it becomes really hard to imagine any scribe so knowing the style of Josephus that they get this right. As in, you'd almost need to have read Josephus lots and lots of times to get his phraseology. And basically back then, where there are people who forge stuff, they're never that good at forging that sort of particularity of phrase. So to do that across a passage, it just isn't plausible.
I completely agree. In fact, there's some scholars that have claimed that phrase is a marker of inauthenticity because Josephus didn't use those phrases. But of course, once we got Greek databases where we could just do a quick search, we realized that actually he uses it all the time. And so one of the arguments of authenticity is that many of these parallels, scholars never, despite editing Josephus, translating it, reading him many, many times, they never noticed these parallels. It took computer databases to reveal these things, which suggests that Christian scribes would have no ability to replicate this kind of language. It really can only come from Josephus. And this is what the field of forensic authorship analysis tells us. It tells us that everybody has this unique idiolect, and that provided you have enough information, you can kind of figure out what someone's style is. And here we have the thumbprint of Josephus all over the passage about Jesus.
Yeah, so idiolect, for those who haven't come across the term before, it's one of those wonderful scholarly terms for your own way of talking and writing. And that's, like you got a dialect, that's for a group, and you have one. You have an idiolect. You may not know it, but you do. So bringing this together, as we've been looking at these two episodes at your work, Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. People can get that from your website, josephusandjesus.com. They can get it from Oxford University Press. Can you sort of put together what significance you think this has for people who are looking into Christianity today, or people who are Christians? What it means for wider culture? Because obviously it's a place where there's a lot of scholarly detail in there, but there's also a wider conversation that's going on. And maybe you can address that. What would you would say to people today who are looking into these things?
First and foremost, this is just another witness to the most amazing human who ever walked the earth, which is special in of itself. But the particular things that it adds is that when you look at historical Jesus theories, secular scholars, they try very hard to figure out, how did the reports of Jesus's miracles, reports of his resurrection develop? And they theorize that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples slowly over the generations these claims were exaggerated, so that Jesus went from being originally just a humble country preacher to this wonder worker, this miracle worker in later Christian generations. But what this book does is, I think it shows that those theories don't stand, that Josephus says that Jesus worked miracles. He's suspicious about their origin. He's worried about whether they're coming from negative supernatural power, demonic power, something like that. But he does think he worked miracles, and he affirms that the disciples did believe on the third day that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that tells us that Josephus didn't view the narrative of Jesus's resurrection as some kind of later artifact that developed after a long game of telephone or something like that. Josephus has every ability to criticize the supernatural. He laughs at magical stories. He exposes imposters. He has no problem talking about and criticizing people who are faking things or lying. But with Jesus, he says, the disciples believed this, that this happened on the third day. And so I think it forces the conversation to what happened on the third day after Jesus died. The disciples came away saying he was raised to life again, and they were willing to lay their lives down for that belief. And Josephus witnesses to that too. He mentions the brother of Jesus being stoned to death, ostensibly for being a Christian. So Josephus also witnesses to their persistence despite persecution in this belief.
Well, that's a wonderful place to end. Tom, we're so glad for you spending time with us, and thank you for writing this Oxford University Press book, Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ, which you can get online. And thank you for joining us on the Tinner House podcast. Thank you to everyone for listening. Please do rate and review. And thank you very much, Tom, for joining us. And God bless you all.